Okay, so the last of our safety questions. Okay. We talk about ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation are essentially ultraviolet and higher, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet. They have enough energy that they can actually cause cell damage, which is what happens when you lay out on the beach for too long. It's the ultraviolet that is damaging those cells, which is what a sunburn is, and can be severe, like if you were to go to sleep for a long time, and it, in fact, could be deadly. Non-ionizing radiation are radio frequencies below the ultraviolet or visible light range. We're talking about infrared and lower. They don't have enough energy to cause DNA or cell damage. It does have enough energy to cause burning or heating of tissue.
I like to think of it as cooking.
Cooking, yes, it can cook you, but it won't hurt your DNA.
No, you just be cooking.
So, what type of radiation are radio signals? Delta.
What is alpha radiation?
It's radioactive. Alphas alphas don't penetrate much, as I recall. Gammas do. You know, gammas the ones that make the Hulk.
The Hulk, right, exactly.
And all this time, I thought that was just fantasy.
Well, the Hulk is, but gamma's not. How does RF radiation differ from ionizing radiation or radioactivity? And that's what happens when you're exposed to too much radioactivity. It actually causes cell damage, DNA damage, and it may not even be visible initially. You kind of die internally before stuff shows up. But the RF radiation doesn't have enough energy to damage your cells or DNA. But it definitely has enough energy to make to create heat and burns. There are exposure limits that have been set, and I believe there's a recent change which was reflected on the newest general exam. They haven't changed it on the technician yet, but there's a little change with the exposure limits and the way they're doing them. But as far as this one's concerned, the station licensee, which is you, when you get your license, you really get two things. You get a station license and an operator's license. So the licensee, which is in your name, is the one that's responsible for most things with your station. And one of these is making sure that you're in compliance with the radiation exposure limits. So they list 3 different ways. There's some FCC bulletin that you can go by to do the calculations. There's computer models you can find on the internet, and the ARL site has a calculator for doing it. Or you can go out and actually measure your field strength with a calibrated field strength meter, not a cheap piece of equipment, and go walk around and see what your milliwatts per square centimeter. Rock.
$100, you can do it. They're not bad. It gives you a good indication. What's going
Yeah,
on.
but it's relative.
It's relative.
This you need a calibrated one so you can actually measure.
10,000
Right. And they want you, well, I think there's another slide. Anytime there's a change, you need to update your exposure calculations. If you change to a different transmitter, you put up a different antenna, or you make a modification, anything that was going to affect the amount of power you're radiating. So who is responsible for ensuring that no person is exposed to RF energy above the FCC exposure limit?
Bravo.
Bravo.
What happens if somebody makes a mistake? What are the consequences?
Well,
Your license.
If cook your neighbor, you get your license revoked.
if you cook your neighbor, probably would be more worried about the liability claim rather than the
Special
FCC.
insurance for this?
I don't know.
Like if you say, I'm gonna build a tower in my house, call the insurance company and say, I'm putting a tower in my house, they might have some special policy that covers that.
I don't know.
I'm just curious. I don't wanna sidetrack the class.
Well, it's an interesting question, but I don't know the answer to it. And the exposure requirements for your neighbor, which we call uncontrolled, is 1/5 of the controlled. So you have to ensure that they're only getting 1/5 of the radiation that you're getting if you're within the limit. There's another chart for that.
My experience has been on 30 megahertz or lower, which is the VHF band, as well as 2 meter and 7 centimeter bands that technicians would be using. Even running a couple hundred watts, you got to be reasonably close, like within 6 feet, to exceed.
Right.
You tell the neighbor to stay off your
generally-
roof, but he goes up there anyway,
Well,
without permission.
Generally speaking,
if you got a 20 element beam and you point it at his house and you're running 1,500 watts, there's a good chance that he's being overexposed.
kind of calculate that situation. Now, if you get up into those, the 2.4 gig and the multi-gig, I don't operate up there, but satellite
Right.
frequencies and stuff, that high power is more
Right.
susceptible to causing a problem.
And the human body is most susceptible in the 30 to 300 megahertz range. That's the lowest exposure that you're allowed. Where lower frequencies and higher frequencies, you can be exposed to more power. It doesn't cause the same kind of heating problem. I think the 50 is they claim, and it's another question coming up. I already gave you the answer to. The 50 megahertz is worst case, apparently, for the human body.
Meters or 6 meter band.
And you can cook your eyeballs like having your head in a microwave, sort of.
The kids should probably never be audited, but I have documentation. I've done it. I've done
Yeah.
the FCC T65 bulletin. In fact, I made a spreadsheet template out of it. And I've also done the ARRL online calculator.
Right.
Well, they're quite a bit different on the results, but I have that.
Oh, really? Oh.
Show someone that they claim that I've thought through it, and
Yeah. You're required, if they ever showed up, to inspect your station for whatever reason. That's one of the things besides your station license you have to have is your calculation or whatever you use to show that you're within permissible limits for exposure.
I would imagine they spend most of their time checking on radio and TV broadcasting.
Well, there's only, I think we're down to what, just a handful of FCC stations around the country, so, you know,
They spend most of their time on interference,
yeah.
someone interfering with someone else, that's what they're gonna do.
Serious interference where there's a lot of complaints and stuff.
They probably never get audited, it's just.
Right. But technically, they could come knock on your door anytime. Not gonna happen, but.
Yeah.
So which of the following is an acceptable method to determine whether you're in compliance with exposure limits?
D.
Delta.
Another all the above? Okay, one of the factors that you use when you're doing the evaluation is duty cycle. And duty cycle is the percentage of time that a transmitter is transmitting. Okay, so if you're transmitting 10 minutes per hour, your duty cycle would be what, 1/6, whatever that is, percent. If you're using something like FT8, which is approximately 50% of the time, it transmits for almost 15 seconds and then it decodes for 15 seconds and then starts over. So that's about a 50% duty cycle because it's transmitting 50% of the time. The duty cycle obviously affects the average exposure. So the higher the duty cycle, when you average that, the larger the exposure. So if you had 100% duty cycle, you know, then the exposure is whatever the maximum. So the duty cycle is a way to reduce the, or shouldn't say reduce. A lower duty cycle lets you have a higher exposure because you're looking at the average. And I think that's what this next statement is trying to say, that the allowable power density is inversely proportional to the duty cycle. So you can have more allowable power the lower the duty cycle is. So for instance, if you're 50%, you can have twice the power density, which in the case of like the 50 megahertz is 1 milliwatt per square meter for controlled environment. So that says you could have 2 milliwatts per square meter. However, your neighbor, being uncontrolled, is 1/5 of that. What is the definition of duty cycle? Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't quite understand the relevance of that, why they're tying duty cycle to power density. I mean, because it almost sounded like they're trying to talk about a safety issue, because they were talking about average exposure, but then I don't quite get the leap from average exposure to density to duty cycle. I don't understand the relevance exactly.
Okay, it's exposure per period of time. Okay, so the power density per unit of time is what they're actually doing. So that's why the duty cycle affects the average amount of power density. So if you're 50% duty cycle, okay, your average power density is going to be half of what it would be if you were running 100% duty cycle.
So if I go into
So
my
if you were running, sorry, so if you were running 100% duty cycle, wouldn't your density would be 100%? Tracking properly.
Right, your duty cycle would be 100%, and whatever your it would be 100% of whatever your power density was in milliwatts per square centimeter.
I'm tracking that, but now now I wonder why do we care about that?
Because
I think
heating is a function of time, and the power density.
There you go, your microwave on for 1 minute, or you gotta do it on for 10 minutes.
So are we concerned
Sit down
about
in my-
over?
Yeah, Paul, if I go to my shack and I go to my transmitter, my VHF antenna for 2 meters is 10 feet away by line of sight out my window, but I go in and I, whatever, press 10 watts on my transmitter, I hit my key in my mic, and I just hold it down for an entire hour. That power density per centimeter squared thing, I'm collecting that for the entire hour. I'm sitting there with my key down, versus if I key it for 5 minutes, let off 5 minutes, key it for 5 minutes, for an hour's time, I'm getting the
Half of it.
The power density is the same, but I'm getting it for a full hour in the one case number one. I'm only getting it for 30 minutes
Out of the hour.
out of the hour on case number two. So they take that into account, that my brain and eyeballs have had less exposure over time, so probably
Right.
not likely to gain as much injury as if I keep the key down the full hour and take the full power density for the full hour.
And this is just one of the factors in the calculation, the duty cycle.
Alrighty, thank you. I'm tracking now. I think I was overthinking it, but I'm tracking with you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, please feel free to ask questions if you don't understand it.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't change the power density at all. It's just that
Right.
how much time are you being exposed to that level of power density? And the duty cycle affects that time.
Okay. So did we do this one?
No,
Oh, yeah, the definition of duty cycle.
Charlie?
Charlie. Why is duty cycle one of the factors used to determine safe RF radiation exposure levels?
Alpha
All right,
or delta.
because it determines the average exposure. Okay, how does the allowable power density for RF safety change if the duty cycle changes from 100% to 50%?
Charlie. Charlie.
Yep. It allows you to have twice the power density, okay, for 50% of the time. The human body, particularly soft tissue, eyes and brain and a few other organs, absorb more RF energy at some frequencies than others. The exposure limits are different for each amateur radio band because of that frequency spectrum. And it turns out that 50 megahertz is the most susceptible frequency. In other words, the power density that is permissible is the lowest at 50 megahertz. The factors that affect it are the frequency and the power level of the field of radiation, the distance from the antenna to the person being radiated, the actual radiation pattern of the antenna. So in the calculation, you need to know, put in whether it's a beam antenna like a Yagi and what the gain is versus something like a vertical antenna, which would be almost omnidirectional, because that affects the power density at a certain distance from the antenna. Handheld is essentially omnidirectional, but it's very close. And when I did the calculation, I think it was at 2 meters, forgot. At 5 watts, for controlled environment, to keep it under a milliwatt per square centimeter, it had to be 10 inches away from me. Now, I forgot what duty cycle that was. And I probably overestimated, worst case, the duty cycle. Because, you talk to somebody and then you listen. So I doubt that you're anywhere near 50% duty cycle in a conversation. And even when you're talking, you're not at peak power all the time. I mean, so, but it tries to take all that stuff into account in the calculations, and they're all just estimates. And I'm sure there's a big safety factor in the chart like that. And this is the old chart. They've made a few additions to it, but we're still dealing with this one for the technician. So the 1 milliwatt per square millimeter in the 30 to 300 range, which is VHF, is the maximum. Well, it's actually the lowest exposure you're allowed within that overall frequency range. And you notice that for uncontrolled, which is somebody that doesn't know they're being radiated, so they don't have the option of like moving because they don't know they're being beamed, it's 0.2 milliwatts per square centimeter. And you have to do those two calculations, or it does the two answers for you. Did you have to do two, or was spit out the same answer when you did the FCC thing?
Not sure what you mean. Split out two.
Or
yeah.
controlled and uncontrolled.
And uncontrolled, yeah, uncontrolled.
Okay.
Yeah.
You might have multiple neighbors.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting there, you're not a town guy, you're minding your own business. This guy keys his mic, then this guy keys his mic, the guy behind keys his mic. And they're doing it different times, getting triple the amount. Yeah.
It could be.
Could be.
That's not in the calculation.
Like I've got attic antennas.
But that's
so-
probably why somebody thought of that and said, make it
But
less.
But I did mine on my, since I have attic antennas, but if anybody outside, lawn worker, neighbor, comes to the front door, the garage door, anywhere around the perimeter of my house, if you're outside, you're not gonna exceed the limit. I've done my calculations to know that, so I don't have to worry about frying somebody outside the house.
There's a question on the extra that deals with your question. And you have to coordinate. But yeah, there was on the current extra exam, there's a question like that, dealing with that scenario where you got multiple.
Well, my wife's on her cell phone for an hour at a time. I'm sure she's getting more radiation than any ham radio stations putting out.
Okay.
Right up to her instrument.
Why do exposure limits vary with frequency?
E. Delta.
At which of the following frequencies does maximum permissible exposure have the lowest value?
Bravo.
Right in the middle of the VHF. Sort of the middle. Logarithmically. What factors affect the RF exposure of people near an amateur station antenna?
All of the above.
All the above. A lot of these, all the above.
Yeah, a lot today.
Okay. They want you to reevaluate your calculations whenever you make a change to a transmitter or antenna or anything that would affect the radiation. In other words, anything that would change the amount of power you're putting out, that would affect the beam width. The narrower your radiation pattern, the higher the density in that particular beam. So that changes the equation. If you change to a different mode where you're running 50% duty cycle instead of, what do they assume for single sideband, 20 or 30?
Depends on if you use compression or not. Yes, could be from 30 to 50, depending on if you're using a compressor.
So, and if your calculations show that you're getting excessive exposure or your neighbor, the uncontrolled people, you can relocate the antenna, you can reduce your transmitting power, or you can lower the duty cycle, or all the above, or get your neighbor to move. Which of the following actions can reduce exposure to RF radiation?
A.
Alpha.
How can you make sure your station stays in compliance with RF safety regulations?
Bravo.
Never do alpha.
Yeah.
Don't tell me.
All right.
You want to get on the radar as much as possible.
Okay, so we talked about the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. So from ultraviolet up are all ionizing radiation forms. Radio signals which are below infrared can't do significant cell damage. Even infrared is just heat. My laser cutter has a infrared, is an infrared CO2 laser, and it just vaporizes material with heat. Exposure limits, the station licensee is the one responsible. You have to do the calculations or measurements if you go that route, and keep it up to date when everything's changed, and it must be at your station in case the FCC would ever come by and inspect. It's unlikely, but that's the rule.
Imagine they probably inspect radio stations and.
Well, commercial stuff, yeah.
But like, those guys have to be inspected, right?
Right.
They're turning in thousands of watts.
Right.
Constantly.
Right. Radiation exposure is frequency dependent. Your body absorbs more RF energy at 50 megahertz than it does at other. So the chart allows the or requires the permissible exposure to be below 1 milliwatt per square meter in the 30 to 300 megahertz band. And that frequency, power, distance, and the radiation pattern all affect the amount of exposure, as well as duty cycle, which should be left in there. Relocating the antenna can reduce exposure, or changing the antenna, something that is less directional perhaps, or if it's a fixed antenna, changing the direction. where you're not pointing at a neighbor, for instance, if that's the problem, where the uncontrolled is over the limit. And you need to reevaluate anytime you make a change. Which reminds me, I got to do that. I got a new radio.
So Jack, for that FCC